Welcome to everybody to the first of a series of rather enticing, certainly enticingly titled lectures, UCL lectures on aspects of the First World War, which are aspects which are not often discussed at all, even noticed. I'm Richard Norton-Taylor, a veteran Guardian journalist from a military family, actually, but writing about wars and occasionally peace for many years. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Clare Makepeace, describes herself as a historian of modern warfare, generally, to talk about sex and the Somme. And Clare has focused on two particular aspects of the two world wars in her research, the visits of British soldiers to brothels in the First World War and prisoners of war in the Second World War. And she's contributed immensely already to our understanding of individuals' experience of warfare, and was inspired, partly, if that's the right word, inspired by the experience of her grandfather, who was captured in Dunkirk. The lecture will be streamed live with the hashtag UCLLHL. Robert Graves wrote in Goodbye to All That, young British soldiers did not want to die virgins, and they ignored instructions from the Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener. Over to you, Clare.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard, for that kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. 100 years on, and so entrenched is the First World War in British popular culture that certain images and ideas about the war instantly come to mind when those three words are uttered. We are likely, for example, to readily picture soldiers waiting in fear in the trench, moments before they were ordered to go over the top. We might evoke the poetry of Wilfred Owen, Robert Graves, or Siegfried Sassoon to imagine what those soldiers were feeling. We think of certain episodes of the war, perhaps the Christmas truce, or the slaughter of the first day of the Somme, or representations of the casualties of battle might come to mind. The Cenotaph in London, for example, or a poppy field, perhaps the one into which Blackadder goes forth faded. In other words, when we speak of the First World War, there is no shortage of imagery, of words, of television or cinematic remakes to shape how we conceive of the experiences of the men involved. Today's UCL lunchtime lecture is about an aspect of the First World War that the black and white photos don't capture, that most post-war productions have chosen not to recognise, and that even amongst academic historians is understudied. That is the Tommy and his officers' visits to brothels whilst they were serving overseas between 1914 and 1918. Rarely does the prostitutes punter speak in British history. Rarely has he recorded his experience of the brothel visit. But the extraneous circumstances of the First World War provided a handful of men with an excuse or a reason to write about these visits. The talk I'm giving today is based upon my findings from their first-hand testimonies, the letters, diaries, memoirs, and oral histories they recorded. First, I will uncover soldiers' reasons for visiting brothels. I will then go on to explore their reactions to them and how these visits varied between different groups of men. Finally, I shall turn to how soldiers dealt with the potential consequences of the brothel visit, venereal disease. Throughout, I will be exploring what the Tommy and his officers' brothel visit tells us about what it meant to be a British man during the First World War. When British soldiers set off for the trenches in 1914, folded inside each of their pay books was a short message. It contained a piece of homely advice written by the Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener. Kitchener reminded soldiers that the honour of the British Army depended on their conduct, and that it was their duty to both show discipline and steadiness under fire, and to be courteous, considerate, and kind to their allied comrades. Kitchener advised his men of how their duty could not be done unless their health was sound. So keep constantly on your guard against any excesses, he warned. In this new experience, you may find temptations both in wine and women. You must entirely resist both temptations, and while treating all women with perfect courtesy, you should avoid any intimacy. Kitchener's decision to issue this advice is unsurprising if we consider the culture of Britain's regular army before the war. At that time, men serving within the army were strongly discouraged from getting married. Only about 6% of enlisted men were eligible for marriage. However, a strong belief persisted within the British military that army morale was dependent on sexual activity, and as a result, sex with prostitutes was accepted as a common alternative to marriage. With much of the British Army scattered over the Empire, it has also become traditional for commanders to allow troops to follow the local sexual customs of where they were stationed. For those going to France, this meant the acceptance of a system of maisons tolérées, or licensed brothels, which had existed there since the mid-19th century. Private Frank Richards was one of those on his way to France. He had seen service in India, was a reservist soldier, and called up the day after the war broke out. He remembered in his memoir men receiving Kitchener's pamphlets and wrote, "They may as well have not been issued for all the notice we took." The "we" that Private Richards refers to is significant. Whilst only a handful of testimonies held in archives in Britain refer to this subject, there is good reason to believe that these men are representative of, at least, a significant minority of soldiers. Venereal disease rates are typically drawn upon to offer some indication of sexual activity. In the British Army, during the Great War, 400,000 cases were treated. For a snapshot of the numbers actually purchasing sex, we can turn to a medical history of the First World War. The history details how British medical authorities were involved in an experiment in Le Havre to limit rates of infection, and as a result, they surveyed one street in the town over a 57-week period. They recorded 171,000 men attending the brothels there. Unlike Richards, most of the men whose testimonies I have looked at in this research either volunteered or were conscripted into the wartime army. They reacted to this new environment with bewilderment, and whether they readily accommodated it or not, it contrasted with their previous life. Sex and women were now recurrent topics of conversation. Private Percy Clare remembered in his memoir this rude shock. The old soldiers who revelled in all the wickedness possible set out to corrupt the volunteer and conscript soldiers from decent homes and womenfolk. These new recruits had never, in their experience, come into contact with it, and now it was to be our daily, hourly portion. There seemed no hope of ever being clean again. One of the reasons why this culture predominated was the widespread belief that regular intercourse was necessary for a man's health. This idea had been dominant in the Victorian era, creating a sexual double standard for men and women. It was still widespread during the war. Private Stephen Graham recorded in his memoir, written in 1919, that sexual intercourse was regarded as a physical necessity for the men. The National Council for Combating Venereal Disease felt the need to include on the syllabus of its lectures to troops the denunciation of the idea that continence is ever harmful and that incontinence is an essential attribute of manliness. And the report of the Cairo Purification Committee a civil military body appointed to recommend ways to reduce VD among troops, noted the entirely erroneous idea, still current, that sexual intercourse is necessary to health. A corresponding assumption appears to have been that as duty was prolonged, the fulfillment of sexual needs would become more urgent. Generally, ordinary soldiers could expect to receive around 2 weeks home leave each year. At Port Said, however, over 9,000 men in the Mounted Corps Egyptian Expeditionary Force had been fighting and marching without leave for more than 12 months. Their army doctor believed they were most likely to indulge in excesses. He estimated a third ultimately did. Other men linked their behaviour specifically to the conditions of war. For some, having intercourse was part and parcel of the fighting. Private Frederick Manning, an Australian writer who settled in Britain in 1903, described how each one of the segregated males, on leaving the trenches, experienced the return of the two fundamental necessities of his nature: food and women. This was less desire than a sheer physical hunger and could not feed itself on dreams. In the shuddering revulsion from death, one turns instinctively to love as an act which seems to affirm the completeness of being. Or as Lieutenant R. Graham Dixon put it, we were not monks, but fighting soldiers, and extraordinarily fit, certainly with an abundance of physical energy. And if bought love is no substitute for the real thing, at any rate, it seemed better than nothing. And in any case, it worked off steam. Other soldiers similarly framed their indulgences within the conditions of war, but they visited brothels more as a refuge from the slaughter of the trenches and imminent death. Lieutenant James H. Buckland, who in 1914 swapped his place at Oxford University for one in the trenches, confided in a letter to his close friend how he had found Rouen ruinous to both his purse and morals. From what I heard out here, I decided quickly that life be enjoyed to the full in Rouen, and so it has been with judicious selection and moderation. The war poet Captain Robert Graves similarly recorded how this particular life experience was more urgent for some. There were no restraints in France. These boys had money to spend and knew they stood a good chance of being killed within a few weeks anyhow. They did not want to die virgins. The horrific conditions British soldiers were facing also meant some loved ones back at home tolerated this behaviour. Autobiographer Gibson Coward remembered an incident at Victoria Station when he met a woman who was in violent hysterics over parting from her husband. He accompanied her home to Whitechapel, and he wrote, "The whole of the way she repeated one phrase again and again: 'I don't care. I don't care if he does go with French women, if only they will make him happy.'" And the writer Virginia Woolf recorded a lecture given to the Richmond branch of the Women's Cooperative Guild in 1917 on venereal diseases and moral risks for our sons. Afterwards, the audience remained silent. 2 women left the room and a third was in tears. Another woman told the lecturer it was a most cruel speech and only a childless woman could have made it, for we mothers try to forget what our sons have to go through. The poor speaker said she was used to it. Under the conditions of warfare, therefore, extramarital intercourse was tolerated, considered a necessity even. But to what extent did it make a boy a man? Undoubtedly, some soldiers came under pressure from their comrades. Private Stephen Graham also commented that hundreds of thousands of men who had led comparatively pure lives until they saw France learned and were even encouraged to go with impure women. The Cairo Purification Committee noted that the abstainer from such intercourse is even at times taunted by his comrades for not having proved his manhood, during that became particularly acute if he was a virgin. However, many more of the men who speak of this subject attest to how they resisted this encouragement. Given the taboo nature of this behaviour, one probably should expect little reticence from the men in avowing to their continence, and their reasons for abstaining are varied, from having a more urgent need for food and sleep, to staying faithful to their wives, to suspecting these women were spies. These men provide a diverse range of explanations, unlike those who indulged, for whom there were just a few acceptable justifications available to explain their actions. This indicates that extramarital virility was not an unacceptable part of being a British man, but neither was it an essential part. Moving on then to the second part of this talk, and the brothel visit itself. I'm going to introduce this section by letting Private Sidney Albert Amat tell you about his first encounter with the brothels in the base port of Le Havre. And this account was recorded by the Imperial War Museum in 1985.
One Friday after pay, we decided to go to Le Havre, and it was about 3.5 miles away, and we walked all the way. There was no transport in those days, and our intention was to go to one of these places of evil intent. And when we got there, the place we wanted to see was, in those days, all those places were out of bounds troops, and the red caps who patrolled the area, keeping it out of bounds, were easy enough to dodge through, and we waited till we saw 2 of them go by and nipped round the corner, and we got into a place called the Rue des Gallions, and this was the red light district of do you want me to go on? Of Le Havre. And on the it was all dark, but along the road was all the red lights in various houses, and you could see a light coming out of doorways, which are nearly always opened. We got into it. The first one was called the Garden of Eden. So we decided to go in there, and we went in, and as you went in, there was a man at the door, seated at the door, and you had to pay him so many centimes to get in before you got to what was a bar. In the bar was well lighted, and there were plenty of troops there, but hardly any British troops, but there was Canadians and South Africans and French troops there, but hardly any, because I think in those days our pay was not sufficient to visit these places very often. Anyway, my pal and I, we went in, and of course you had to buy a drink. We bought a drink and sat down and viewed the scene, and it was really rather illuminating. There was about a dozen girls in there, and with hardly anything on, and high-heeled shoes. They had little, I think what was called chemises then, and they were sitting about on the troops' knees and in all sorts of places. And apparently the idea was that if you fancied any girl, you bought her a drink and then you took her upstairs. Well, before you went upstairs, there was a woman, which I afterwards found out was the madam of the establishment, and you had to pay her, I think it was a franc before you went upstairs. And then, of course, you had to pay the girl you took upstairs as well. So, as I say, our money was so small in those days that all we could buy was a drink and a look round before we came out again.
Amat's account provides us with a vivid picture of what a licensed brothel in a port town was like. Here, professional prostitutes worked under a madam and were subject to regular medical inspections. By 1917, there were at least 137 such establishments spread across 35 towns in France. Yet this is not the only setting where we should imagine prostitution taking place. There are also many references in these first-hand accounts of sex being purchasable from French women in the estaminets or cafes of the local villages. Amat also describes the brothel he visited as being out of bounds. Actually, licensed brothels were only officially put out of bounds to British troops in March 1918. And contrary to Amat's account, whereas his entrance to the brothel had to be rather furtive, the general impression gained from other sources is that there was no secrecy surrounding these brothel visits. When Corporal Jack Wood was given a few hours of leave from the Western Front, he went to a nearby town and described in his diary the scene. We had never heard of the renowned red lamp with a big number 3 on it, but never thought of the reality of the thing. My first view I shall never forget. There was a great crowd of fellows, 4 or 5 deep, and about 30 yards in length, waiting, just like a crowd waiting for a football cup tie in Blighty. It was half an hour before opening time, so we had to see the opening ceremony. At about 5 minutes to 6, the lamp was lit. To the minute at 6, the door was opened. Then commenced the crush to get in. Both Amat and Wood refer to the Red Lamp brothel, but the brothel visit varied according to the status of the client. Red lamps generally accommodated the other ranks, and blue lamps were reserved for officers. Second Lieutenant Dennis Wheatley's commission, which he received when he was just 17, entitled him to patronise one of the most luxurious brothels in France. He wrote of how, upon arrival, the madam took me to an 8-sided room, the walls and ceilings of which were entirely covered with mirrors. The only furniture in it was a low divan on which a pretty little blonde was displaying her charms. She welcomed me most pleasantly, and later we breakfasted off an omelette, melon, and champagne. The professional soldier Brigadier General Frank Crozier also described how officers and other ranks' experiences starkly differed. The officers are better off, he wrote in his memoir. Comparative luxury, knowledge, and armour, meaning condoms, stands them in good stead. It is one thing sleeping the night in Lena's arms after a not-too-good dinner and minding one's P's and Q's. It is another making the best of it in a thorny ditch. In fact, according to Crozier, British officers were actually more ready to bed the prostitutes of their German enemy than share the same women with their own men. Crozier notes how British officers took over the high-class prostitutes of the German army at the close of the war. It was also considered more acceptable for married men to visit the brothel. Lance Corporal Albert Cheney, writing 50 years after the armistice, remembered how, as an 18-year-old, he was told that brothels were not for young lads like me, but for married men who were missing their wives. According to Private Percy Clare, the brigade chaplain excused unfaithfulness to wives in such circumstances, but advised the men to only use the maison tolérée, otherwise they might have contracted disease. This may seem perverse to us now, but this thinking reflects the idea that intercourse was a physical necessity for men. These men had become accustomed to sex in the marital bed, and now, deprived of this regular satisfaction, the brothel was regarded as an acceptable alternative. Meanwhile, British Dominion and colonial soldiers all had differing levels of access to prostitutes. Amat spoke of how British soldiers were at the Garden of Eden and how few of them were there because their pay was insufficient. Another soldier, Bert Ferns, also remembered in his oral history how disparate pay meant at one brothel the Australian soldiers queued outside one door and got the younger women, while the British formed a separate queue and got the older ones. Colonial soldiers, however, were completely prohibited entry to the brothels. Indian troops, when in France, faced severe restrictions on their off-base activity, which aimed to prevent any sexual interactions with white women. Men in the South African National Labour Corps were housed in camps surrounded by a wire stockade and given limited leave. The lines of communication promptly repealed an order issued by the Army Provost Marshal at Dieppe that had allowed the Chinese to enter brothels. These soldiers were ranked below the white female prostitute, suggesting the limits of even a licensed brothel as a patriarchal institution. Turning now to the final part of my talk and the potential consequences of the brothel visit. There were, as I've said, 400,000 cases of venereal disease during the war. In 1916, 1 in 5 of all admissions of British and Dominion troops to hospitals in France and Belgium was for VD. Venereal disease is more of a marker of extramarital behaviour than commercial sex itself, but how men reacted to VD tells us about British manhood at this time. There appears to have been a strong belief that prostitution should be regulated in order to allow for safe, promiscuous male behaviour. Private James Dixon recalled in his oral history how the red lamps at Bethune had just been inspected by our doctor, one of our doctors. A Private William Roth also wrote in his memoir of how he was advised that the whores at the camp brothel were clean and free from the pox. They were examined by our own doctors and not allowed if they were found dirty. Company commanders informed their men that such brothels were controlled by the state and they should avoid the villages of France. Indeed, Field Marshal Douglas Haig argued in June 1918 that the Maison Tolérée should have been kept open to British troops, since their prostitutes were cleaner than others. Checking for the disease appears also to have been a ritual of the brothel visit itself. Roth also wrote of how he was checked on entry by the usual old lady cock examiner and by a prostitute who took hold of my business and examined it very carefully to satisfy herself that he was clean and free from the gonorrhea. And I'll let Private George Ashurst tell you himself of how men were checked and treated for VD once in the brothel. And again, this interview was recorded by the Imperial War Museum, this time in 1987.
What did you think about the women and the prostitutes? Were you tempted?
Oh, so common. Oh, no, I didn't fancy them at all. I said to Tom, said, are you going up there? I said, no, not with them things. Because they were, all sorts of ages, the women. And this fellow's probably tell you what it was like going in, She's there, and the first thing she does is grab your 5 franc notes. That's the first thing she does. Put it there, And then she unfastens your flies and has a feel and squeezes it, see if there's anything wrong with it. And then she just throws this cloak off and she's on the bed, like this, ready for you. That's what happens. And then when you've finished, she has a kettle boiling there with some herbs in. She'll just give you a bit of a swill with it, safety's sake, that for disease, But no, I didn't go over there, not with that lot.
The British Army did take measures to limit the numbers contracting VD, but these were far from rigorously applied. Firstly, British soldiers were denied possession of prophylactics for most of the war. It was only in August 1918 when the British soldiers stationed in his home Isles would have received a bottle of potassium permanganate lotion, cotton wool, and chamomile cream, and in the last month of the war when overseas. Secondly, there was also no punishment for contracting VD, just concealing it. A 1916 order directed soldiers to get treatment within 24 hours, but it was far from clear whether this meant they should go to the disinfecting station 24 hours after exposure or 24 hours after the first sign of the disease. A second letter in 1918 demanded that soldiers seek treatment after exposure, but again, there was no obligation, with the main deterrent resting on discovery of the soldier concealing the infection. The third measure illustrating the Army's muted response towards VD infections is the reversal halfway through the war of informing the next of kin when their loved one was suffering from VD. For the first 2 years of the war, the next of kin was told, but in 1916, the Army suspended this notification, which was attributed to a major's suicide on hearing that his wife had been informed of his venereal infection. Interestingly, this policy of notification was abandoned within weeks of conscription being introduced for married men, at which point the typical profile of the next of kin might have changed from that of a parent to that of a wife. One might expect it was even more imperative for the next of kin, the wife, to be informed of the nature of her husband's illness, since she and her future children were now at risk. But again, if regular intercourse was considered a necessity, why should a soldier be punished for indulgences, which many regarded as natural behaviour consequential on his marital status, but under the unnatural conditions of war? Therefore, whilst catching VD was not something that was immediately considered to be wrong, it was still not something that men seemed to have discussed. No man in these testimonies admits to suffering from venereal disease, nor more significantly is he aware of any of his fellow soldiers being afflicted. George Ashurst could not remember a single case of VD, despite thinking that most men indulged in brothel visits. Buckland amidst his discussion of his sexual escapades in Rouen, where VD rates far exceeded infection rates of other French towns, told his confidant in England that he was feeling very fit and so far from catching what you said. This silence is matched by a confidence that the disease could be easily controlled or avoided. According to Private James Dixon, in his oral history, despite VD being common in the army, you kept yourself clean. Lieutenant Harold Mellerish remembered how the Sandhurst pups spoke airily of ways to avoid it, whilst Butlin, writing from the famous Craig Lockhart War Hospital, believed that no man need get venereal disease unless he wants to. This seems to be optimistic thinking, yet Butlin's words, "No man need get venereal disease unless he wants to," are important. We should not think that contracting VD was unwelcome to every man. The few overt references to men infected with venereal disease in these sources are to those who actively courted the disease to avoid further action. Driver Roland Meriden Luther observed in his memoir, written some 30 years after the armistice, that a great many soldiers were prepared to chance venereal disease rather than face a return to the front. The total number thus infected must have been stupendous, both officers and men alike. In fact, contraction of such a disease seemed to be sought after, even if only to keep a man from the front during treatment. J.S. Wayne, a YMCA welfare officer, also recorded in his diary a speech made by a colleague in which he referred to some men who deliberately risked contracting one of the two diseases, hoping by this self-inflicted wound to win a respite from the trenches. There was no protest from the men. Perhaps they knew it was true of some of them. The authorities certainly believed it. And according to Miss Etty Rout, secretary to the New Zealand Volunteers Sisterhood, who advocated the use of prophylaxis during the war, the diseased prostitute got more money than the clean one. Some men wanted to get diseased during the war. The contraction of an infection meant a hospital stay of about 30 days. During an era when syphilis was treated with injections of mercury, which usually did nothing to prevent the fatal progression of the disease years later, this behaviour provides an important insight into the lengths a man might go to have a respite from the carnage of the front line. And once men were permanently away from the front line, once the war had ended, did this sexual behaviour continue into peacetime? Now that question is hard to answer because the first-hand accounts I have drawn from in my research largely end their narratives with the end of the war. However, if a couple of the observations from my sample of testimonies are any indication, it seems that this behaviour was confined to the extraordinary circumstances of war. Private William Holt wrote of how the red lamps amused and disgusted me, and then faded away completely when I left the towns. Similarly, for Lieutenant Dixon, the business was compartmentalised. It was, as it were, shut off from normal human relationships and belonged to this lunatic world of war and to nowhere else. To conclude, why is it important to remember, as part of the First World War centenary, this aspect of the lunatic world of war? A historian's job is to understand lives in the past in all their complexity. What troubles me about the centenary is that many of the projects, in my opinion, simplify our understanding of the war. They erase that complexity that surrounded soldiers' lives. For example, one event that has been singled out for commemoration is the Christmas Truce football match. In Prince William's words, it remains wholly relevant today as a message of hope over adversity, even in the bleakest of times. Of course, that's a very positive message to capture, but I also think it's important that that message is accompanied by, well, firstly, an acknowledgement that there is no hard evidence that football was even played during the Christmas truce, and secondly, the context which surrounded any truce. The High Command issues stringent orders against such behaviour. Or to give you another example of an ongoing project, the letter to an unknown soldier. There's a statue of a soldier standing on platform 1 of Paddington Station, and he is reading a letter. This project invites members of the public to write that letter he is reading. In this case, we aren't even trying to achieve the more complicated task of understanding what those relatives went through whilst their loved ones were at the front. Instead, we are simply imposing our own emotions onto them. What I particularly like about the subject I've discussed today is that it complicates the terms in which we think of the First World War. As I said at the start of this lecture, when we think of the First World War, we readily think of soldiers going over the top or waiting in fear for that moment. What we don't think of is the very unidealistic or unsentimental way in which many men reacted to that prospect. They had sex with prostitutes. Or the ideas we have about fraternization or comradeship are suddenly thrown askew when we think that different classes of brothels were created for British officers and British other ranks. And when we remember that British officers were more prepared to share prostitutes with their German counterparts than with their own men. However, perhaps for me, what is the most complex aspect of this particular history of the First World War is one I haven't even mentioned. And that is what the prostitutes went through during the war. I haven't discussed these women at all for the simple reason that I can find no account produced by a prostitute on what she went through during the First World War, what for her this experience was like. I've only found one account from the various trawls I've done of the archives in which a soldier reflects upon what these women went through. I'm going to end with this account, partly because the last thing I want is for you to assume that my silence on the prostitutes' experience means I think of them as some sort of passive or unfeeling objects. Also, I'm ending with this account because I find it very troubling. It troubles me because it is harrowing to listen to, and also because I'm not sure how to interpret it or what to do with it, because it sits so uneasily with so many of the narratives that are dominant today about life in the First World War. This extract is from the memoir of Lance Corporal Albert Cheney, who we heard from earlier. And as I said, I shall end with his words. Cheney writes, "I began to ask questions about the girls in these establishments. I was only 18 years of age at the time, not too interested in the opposite sex, but the stories that went around regarding those girls were interesting enough. The girls had never had so many customers before, it was said, and were completely done up by the end of each day. They had to be sent home in cabs, as by that time most of the girls were unable to walk. In some cases, it was whispered they could not even close their legs after the rough treatment from some of the more impertinent of the men." Thank you for listening.
Claire, thanks very much indeed. That was very illuminating and interesting, and a couple of points I'll pick up. But there's about 20 minutes or so of questions on that sort of rather amusing point of how doctors, rather not doctors, officers and men, and the officers had different brothels, and the officers preferred to go where the German officers went rather than with their own other ranks and men. But the general point about how they struggled with their consciences, really, and worked it out, squaring it with their emotions and conflicting emotions, really, the married ones, the virgins, and so on. I think that was really quite moving and obviously deeply personal. Thank you very much. Now, questions? And I think there's a mic going around, actually. We have to wait for a mic. The lady with the mic there. So at the back there with the white shirt. And then if you get my attention as we proceed.
Hi, very enjoyable lecture. I'm just wondering, I mean, so many men around. You didn't mention anything about homosexuality. And I would imagine at that time, of course, it would be extremely furtive and no one would probably admit to it. But are there any sort of records as to whether gay sex was prevalent, not necessarily in the trenches, but certainly elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't touch on that because it sort of fell outside the scope of my lecture, but actually there has been a certain amount of work more on homoeroticism of the trenches, some on homosexuality, but much more on the wider area of homoeroticism. And actually that has been much more tackled by the historians than heterosexual behaviour, which is why I focused on this aspect.
Who's next? I was going to ask when you were thinking about Kitchener. Was Kitchener, was he sort of unimaginative, or did he mean what he says when he says you mustn't go to any brothel?
Yeah, I think he meant what he said, actually. Yeah, I mean, there was quite a difference of opinion, both within the army and actually the government as well, about whether brothels should be in or out of bounds. And they were eventually put out of bounds in March 1918 after quite extensive lobbying by social purity organisations, but that was still against the will of people like Douglas Haig.
Right, okay. Oh, very quiet. Okay.
I've been reading accounts recently of GIs going back
So,
to...
can you hold on one sec, sorry.
Thank you. I've been reading accounts recently of GIs going back to Vietnam to find children. Are there any accounts from the First World War of Tommy going back for a child?
That's a very good question, and not one I've got much evidence to answer with. I would think there are, but I can't say for sure. It's not something, again, that has come up in the sources that I've read. Possibly not as common as the Vietnam War, because there was less interaction between civilians and soldiers with trench warfare than there have been in subsequent wars to the First World War. But I'm sure there are examples of that happening.
I have a former colleague of mine, a bit older than me actually, who did national service in Korea. He spent most of his time not on the front, but actually in the back, typing out VD instruction forms or warning forms for people before they had an army in Hong Kong there, I think.
Right.
Which was an easy place to go from Korea. Similar place to Vietnam, maybe, but...
Yeah.
Okay. And then
Hi there. You mentioned at the end of your talk about the remembrance of the First World War and how we create these narratives that create and make us remember a very simplified view of the First World War. I wondered if you had any suggestions about how we could complicate it more and how we can remember it in a more realistic way.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, there are two aspects of remembering. I mean, I find the way in which we remember the centenary fascinating to explore today, because I think it tells us actually much more about society today and our priorities than actually what happened in the First World War. I think we could do, if we want to actually remember sort of what happened, it would be quite easy not to sentimentalise it so much. I would prefer people sort of acknowledge the horror and the carnage a bit more, or in more detail, in a more realistic way. And I think actually it would be lovely if First World War historians could be more involved in things like the centenary. And I've been quite surprised at how much sort of celebrities are leading the way who haven't worked on the subject. So I think if more historians who specialise in this area could get involved, then one would have sort of more accuracy and more projects which aim to understand what the soldiers went through rather than focus on how we want to understand it. But I'm not sure, my way of understanding or looking at memory and history is always looking at what that tells us about a particular generation than what that tells us about the experience that generation claims to be remembering.
Thank you. Over here. Yeah, thanks.
Hi. We focused mainly on the Western Front. Do we know if that was atypical, the level of activity, or would it have been similar on the Eastern Front or the Italian Front, for example?
Yeah, I mean, the only other area which came up a lot in the sources was Egypt, and I actually referred to the Cairo Purification Committee. So where sort of licensed or tolerated brothels existed, I think it's fair to say that that sort of behaviour was quite common and representative of other spheres. I mean, you might have noted that I said most post-war productions don't look at this aspect of the war. There is one exception, which is the film Gallipoli, where actually there is a visit of a soldier and a group of soldiers sort of contemplating going into a brothel, which I think probably shows that, again, for for Australian soldiers, this was actually more common in Dominion soldiers than for British soldiers, because they were far from home, they didn't have the chance to go back to see loved ones, and of course they had higher pay.
Once Tommy had reported himself to the MO, what was actually done for him? I mean, the arsenicals had just been introduced against syphilis, but what was his treatment actually like?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Oh,
sorry.
Once the soldier had reported to the MO that he had a dose or whatever,
Yeah.
how was he treated?
Okay. Normally a stay in a hospital for 30 days in a specific part of the hospital. Again, and I didn't talk about this, but actually the VD treatment centres were also segregated. And in one source it talks of there being treatment centres for other ranks and for officers at Le Havre. So they were treated and often had a stay in hospital of about 30 days.
How were they treated? The arsenical drugs against syphilis were just coming in, but other than that, what passed for treatment, as there were no effective antimicrobials?
Yeah, that's actually the only reference is actually doses of drugs. Again, officers got more doses than the other ranks. Officers got 12 doses, other ranks got 8. That's the actual treatment I've read about. There are also actually some images of soldiers being treated for VD in the medical history I referred to, which talked about soldiers being counted, visiting the brothels in one street in Le Havre. So if you're interested in that, I can definitely direct you to the pages. It's in the British Library, and yeah, fascinating, rare chance to see a photo of anything to do with this topic.
I think it's really interesting because a lot of this simplistic, one aspect of it is the kind of using one's imagination, simplistic view of people in the trenches, black and white films, horror and all that, as we know. But actually, there was a village round the corner, almost round the corner.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't have to go far to go to find a brothel.
No, and as I said, they were often, men were visiting prostitutes in the villages in which they were billeted.
Exactly,
yeah. So it wasn't maybe more common behaviour in sort of the licensed brothels existed in the big towns. But yes, and there, again, I didn't go into it in this talk, but one could also explore the amateur prostitutes and the professional prostitutes. And there's some work being done on that. There's probably scope for more to be done on that, but my focus was the professional.
Women who would go to the front to get rich, apart from anything else, or get richer, to get clients, which otherwise.
Yeah, I haven't read so much about women sort of following the troops round, although it did happen, but more women who were already resident in these villages. Yeah.
Behind you, there's a mic here.
Hello, I was just wondering if there's any knock-on effect or comparison to the Second World War that, the age between them, then sort of daughters of the prostitutes, there would be a memory of these brothels. Was there any effect, or have you ever looked into that effect on the Second World War, or anything that lessons learned from what happened in the First World War, or any changes that were made because of it?
Yeah, great question. As I said, this is a very underexplored area amongst even academics, so I think you've just come up with a couple of great projects there. I mean, when I was thinking of what to do for a PhD, I did think I could just do this subject again for the Second World War, because there's a gaping hole there as well. I think looking, if you could find the sources on how prostitution was remembered within families, that would be incredible. I doubt very much there are many of them. But I think again, there isn't that much. There needs to be more history looking at how the Second World War and the First World War fit together. And I think this would be a great way of looking how their memory altered and comparing the two.
And on the Second World War, since it's your on the special subject of prisoners of war, the Second World War. It's a bit of a non-sequitur in a way, although dealing with the emotions or the physical proximity of men in a camp. What was it? Was there sort of developed relationships? Was there a masturbation, homosexual relationships?
Yeah.
I mean, was there any evidence of how they would, relieve themselves?
Yeah, on prisoners of war in the Second World War. Yeah, well, for officers were held in central camps, separated from the other ranks who were often in working camps. Other ranks did have relationships with civilian women, German and Polish women most commonly, and that did happen quite a lot. Within the camps, I looked at ideas around heterosexuality, and I did find that actually it became a very sort of changing notion and quite a fluid idea of what was acceptable between different men, what sort of relationships were acceptable. And whilst I didn't find in the sample of sources I looked at too much evidence of overt homosexuality, there was definitely changing conceptions. So, for example, there were often cross-dressers in camps in theatre productions, and men often speak in very, very admiring tones about how beautiful these women were, and these narratives went beyond the stage, as it were. So there was sort of changing ideas. I concluded that notions of male heterosexuality became much more fluid in the central POW camp.
Very good. There's a question over there, I think, at the back, or quite near the back.
Hi. When you did your research, you didn't find any evidence or like any accounts of what the war was like in terms of Sorry. I'm just going to start again.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry. You know how at the end of the lecture you said you couldn't find any accounts of what the war was like from the prostitutes' point of view? Is that just because you just didn't look that much into it, or is there like no evidence whatsoever?
I don't think there's any evidence. I know other scholars as well have looked in archives in France for evidence of any accounts of what prostitutes have written themselves and haven't been able to find any. And I don't find that very surprising because they probably wouldn't have had the materials, might not have had the literacy rates to actually write down the experience, and might not have wanted to write it down in a memoir. So for all those reasons, it doesn't surprise me, but scholars have looked for those sources, and they don't seem to exist.
So how comes... Can you hear me?
Just about.
Sorry.
Yep. So
how come, no historian has actually tried to find one and talk to one about their...
They wouldn't probably be alive anymore.
No,
and if you think about the changing nature of history, historians have only recently started to look at this area. In terms of masculinity in the First World War is a relatively recent subject of sort of 10 or 15 years really. And as I said again, this subject historians haven't really explored very much. So I think by the time we've engaged with this topic, I think the opportunity has passed to find any of these women, even if one could, and carry out interviews. But as I said, there are so few discussions of this subject, even in the oral histories by men, that you're looking at such a small, unusual number of prostitutes who might have been willing to speak on this.
We're getting nearer 2 o'clock. Have you mined the archives of the Imperial War Museum and so on?
Yeah.
You've seen them all, basically.
Yeah, I mean, the Imperial War Museum has been my main source base, and they've got brilliant sources. Mainly, I draw upon memoirs and oral histories, but there were a few letters in there, as you'll have seen, and a couple of diaries talking about this subject. But it often it's one of those slightly frustrating subjects in that you probably have to read an entire memoir and you come away with a couple of,
exactly, yeah.
One of those.
Takes time, yeah.
And I have had to also rely on the superb cataloguing done by the archivists of the Imperial War Museum, because there's only so much one can read with a hope that it will crop up.
Absolutely, yeah.
But that's definitely the main source space for this topic.
Well, let's do another question. Claire, so we thank Claire very much indeed for
Thank you very much.